This is a Willets Point Shea Stadium bound 7 express train. The next and last stop is Willets Point, Shea Stadium.
Oh, yes, it is the Subway to Shea podcast. Anthony Rivera here with you, talking about all the news and happenings surrounding that team from Queens, the New York Mets. It's episode 181 from the Subway to Shea studio in my office. Make sure you're following Subway to Shea on X, Instagram, and TikTok at Subway to Shea. You can follow me at AntRivera86. Subscribe on YouTube right here. Like the video. Make sure you're sharing it. And if you want to listen to it, on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. We already got 56 people in the room so far, so you already know what we're talking about. I want to bring on my guest today, Marc Luino, Giraffe Neck Marc, co-host of Mets Up podcast. You've seen James Shiano on the show before. We're getting Giraffe Neck Marc on for the first time. What's on, my friend? How you doing?
Dude, doing well, man. It's a good episode to hop on. We got a lot to talk about today.
Yeah, so much to talk about. And it feels like news keeps dropping, every half hour. We're getting numbers now on the whole Pete Alonso situation. So we're going to start right there because it seems like the Mets are getting ready to pivot from Pete Alonso. I don't want to say it's absolutely no chance that they get him, but that's the feeling that we're getting from the media. Andy Martino was the first on it to report that the Mets have pivoted to what is a kind of plan B post Alonso type deal here. Now considering the most likely outcome that he will not sign with the Mets, that he'll sign elsewhere, which is the reason why they signed Jesse Winker. And we'll get into Jesse a little bit later on in the show. And it looks like they are going to go in a different direction, maybe add a reliever or possibly a top reliever. John Heyman said that there were so many gaps in these talks, whether it was the years, whether it was the numbers, but it seems like the years kind of, has kind of come together where they were okay going that short-term 3-year deal. Joel Sherman posted it for the New York Post, probably, I want to say about 45 minutes ago, that there was this last-ditch kind of effort from the Mets where they had offered him a 3-year deal, between 68 to 70 mil, which is kind of rounds out to what, $23 million AAV. And I know a lot of fans I've already talked with on X are like, this is kind of insulting to Pete Alonso here. But Christian Walker, if you're looking at the first baseman this year, Christian Walker got the highest deal so far, 3 years, 60 mil. So he'd already topped that. And if you think about it, going way back to 2023, that middle of the year, 7 years, 158. I mean, he turned it down.
Yeah, that's the big problem here is that, I mean, talking about like losing free agency, Pete Alonso's unfortunately on the side of losing. And as much as I would still love him back as the New York Mets, it's hard when you see like the top salaries going into 2025 at the first base position. 23 puts him ahead of Matt Olson, behind Freddie Freeman. And truthfully, that's about where Pete Alonso is. He is not one of these 3 best first basemen in the league right now with Harper, Guerrero, Freddie Freeman. I think he is definitely in that next tier. You could make an argument that Matt Olson is better than Pete Alonso right now. I think him getting that, while it's not what he wants, it's not what he expected, at least you would have thought there would have been a conversation where they would have been able to maybe settle on 3 for 75. And I think that's something that would have been attainable based on where it seems like the Mets were. So I'm wondering, I mean, surely the Alonso camp and Boris was then looking for a 3 for 90. I know they were talking about that they wanted opt-outs. The Mets were not offering opt-outs. It just seems like right now, Pete is not going to be coming back, which is kind of a crazy thing. I didn't think that would be a feeling I'd have at all this offseason.
No, absolutely. I thought he was more of a definite return than Juan Soto coming here was ever to be thought of when we were looking at the beginning of the offseason. And I think it was Will Salmon who posted this article probably about a week or two ago. And it was, what we could possibly see in a type of deal between the Mets and Pete Alonso, where I think it was like 3 for 91.3, something like that. And all of it came out to, Scott Boras kind of getting what he wants, which is the highest AAV. He'd be higher than the current high guy in Freddie Freeman. And then he would kind of top what was, I think, Miguel Cabrera's, although it was a longer deal, but his annual value as well. So there still seems to be this disconnect, but I just don't see anyone else getting into this business. Like if if the Mets, who have probably the most money, let's be real here, they
Yeah.
have the most money to spend with Steve Cohen, if they're not going to budge, why would any other team budge as well?
Yeah, I mean, like, the only team that really feels like could be dangerous in these two scenarios with, like, taking Pete would be, like, maybe the Blue Jays who have now been connected to him. But, like, are they gonna keep Vlad Guerrero Jr. then? That's something interesting to think about. And then the Giants feel like they could be a sleeper team just because it seems like they are trying to make a push. They need to get a lot better on the offensive side in order to compete in that National League West. But is that a move that Buster Posey wants to make? Because if Pete's not taking 3 for 70 from the team that, he wanted to play for, he had all these connections to as a homegrown guy, the number might just be too high for anyone to really be interested.
Yeah. And I think if I'm Pete, I don't think I want any part of San Francisco. I don't think his numbers are going to translate out there, the power wise. Toronto seems like the logical fit with everything that's going on with Vlad Guerrero Jr. But there seems to be this, I don't know, some reporters are saying that they're trying to offer Vlad an extension. If they were to bring in Pete, maybe they'll move him to third base and figure something how to work there. I don't see them paying Vladimir Guerrero close to, what is it, $400 million that I'm pretty sure he's going to get with no problem if it was the Mets or, maybe even the Yankees, because they only have Paul Goldschmidt for a year. So the options are very, very, very limited.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like he has a lot of places to go. There are places that make sense, but those teams are surely not going to pay the money that he wants. Like the Mariners so desperately need a first baseman. Pete Alonso makes so much sense there. Or like a team like the Pittsburgh Pirates, where I thought Pete would be phenomenal with that team, that lineup, and being a part of like that future organization going forward. But those teams we know aren't going to spend, so you can just throw them out the window right now. And at that point, if you're going to drop to a contract where they're going to be able to be involved, he's just going to go back to the Mets at that point. Like they're not going to outbid, I think, what the Mets had at 3 for 70, let's even say.
I'm surprised that even with, them giving him the 3 for 70, that there was no opt-outs involved. It kind of, cushioning this deal for him, making him feel, I feel like at home. Obviously you would want the opt-out considering what happened last season.
Yes.
With Pete not having the best of years. I mean, you look on the outside and those are pretty good numbers, but as a Met fan, you see what he did, and not being able to deliver with runners in scoring position and in big spots outside of the postseason. The regular season was not great, but Pete wants the opt-outs. The Mets, I was surprised that they weren't willing to give the opt-out and offer him that deal there. I feel like the Mets kind of wanted him more than he thinks that they want him.
It feels like definitely Pete's confused for sure about how badly he is wanted back or how important he is conceptually to the organization. We talked about it on Mets Up today where we were like, hey, like Pete loves the spotlight. We know that. He might think that he's a bigger deal than he truly is. And that's not anything against him. Like he was a great player, is a great player. But at the end of the day, we just know the value that first base has to an organization and to a team. And when the Mets see Vlad Jr., who's available on the market the following year, like it's difficult to be able to give Pete what he wants, knowing that there are better options available. And at the end of the day, like for a guy like Pete, it seems like it's getting into a bit of a like who has bigger balls contest between like him and David Stearns, where it's like Stearns like, all right, here's our offer. Take it or leave it. You don't want it? Okay, we'll see you in a month from now when you're still not signed. Are you going to come back and take our offer then? Maybe it's not the same. It just feels like there's a lot of chess being played between the two, and very much so on the side of David Stearns, where it's like, you've come down already a ton. We heard Boris, a week ago say that they want a Prince Fielder-like contract for Pete Alonso. That the offer that they're talking about with the Mets is not even close to that they came to the Mets with. So I think at this point, if you're the Mets, be really patient, and kind of how they've been handling it. And we saw now it's about plan B. If Pete Alonso's not part of this team, we have to think about it like he's not a part of this team right now, because you can't keep waiting on this guy.
Yeah, and I know a lot of Met fans love Pete. Look, I love Pete. I'm
Me
pretty
too,
sure
yeah.
you love Pete.
Love him.
He's a fan favorite, homegrown.
It's awesome.
But this team needs to, take care of business on the business side of things. How many times in the past have we been burnt by huge contract after huge contract for decades? And now we have stability in the front office, whether you like a lot of the moves that he's made or not so far. They may not have been flashy, But we're talking about David Stearns, who comes in and in year one takes the Mets to within 2 games of the World Series with a brand new manager, first-time manager, and a lot of, probably not a top-line rotation if you look at it on paper.
No.
You got young kids coming to play, and he was able to get the best out of them. Maybe there was a lot of vibes involved, and you talk about grim and all the outside stuff, but they made it to within 2 games of the World Series. So I wish that the fan base had just a little bit more patience when it comes to this.
It's crazy. It's like we forgot what happened last year. And I know, like, let's be honest, a lot of things did go right. And that team, I think, on paper was still significantly worse than the Dodgers. And right now we're chasing the Dodgers. We can compete with the Phillies. We can compete with the Braves. We might not be better than them on paper as of right now, as of today, but competitive. The Dodgers are still heads above everybody else right now in the National League. The National League's loaded. But I feel like there's this weird, like, Stockholm syndrome going on with Mets fans where we were we were kidnapped by the Wilpons. We were kidnapped by previous regimes where we're just used to, like, every move was a cheap move. Every move was bad. And they were for bad players. Where this Mets organization now under David Stearns operates so differently. Yes, he is still going to go get the value guys. He's going to sign Griffin Canning, who is statistically the worst pitcher in baseball, for $4 million. But that is different than where Mets fans and Mets moves have been in the past. And you mentioned the bad contracts. David Stearns looks like he's trying to avoid bad contracts at every single chance possible. Like Pete for 390 or 3 for 90, like, isn't a bad contract, but it's not the best. And right now the Mets hold the keys. There's no reason to rush. A lot of people also forget it's January 16th. Spring training doesn't start for a month. Pitchers and catchers don't report for a month. There's still so much time. And the longer and longer it goes on, the more leverage the Mets have, and Pete Alonso doesn't.
Yeah, like Carlos Ramos says here, agrees with you. We don't have a first baseman right now, but opening day is not tomorrow.
Yep.
And it's so important. How many times in this team's history, definitely in our lifetime, have the Mets held this much leverage over a player? It's never happened before.
Never,
and they finally have it on there. Yeah, it's not fun, for Pete or the fans to sit here and wait. But you want to hold as much as you can because the price is going to eventually come down. And we've seen it with Scott Boras' clients last year. His prices came down. They wait. Like a lot of these players waited. At the very least, he's not a pitcher. So, even if you wait into spring training, it's okay. But, I think that they have all the leverage in the world. And I wouldn't budge. I really wouldn't.
I wouldn't either. And I think, like, David Stearns has, I would hope, gained the trust of a lot of Mets fans in one season, considering what he did last year with that roster where they ended up going. I just trust the guy. I trust the process. I trust what he's been doing. I can see where his vision is. He's getting paid the big bucks by the richest man in baseball to be the president of baseball operations, to run everything that's going on there. I just believe that he has a plan in place that's going to lead this team to be successful. Look at those Brewers teams that he was a part of too. Like, they were not good teams on paper either. And yet year after year after year, they're successful. And truthfully, you get to the playoffs, get hot at the right time. Anybody can make a run, kind of like we did last year. So to me, I think Mets fans, as crazy as it sounds, need to continue to be patient. And again, we did sign Juan Soto this offseason. It's not like they didn't do like nothing. And Sean Manaea is back, which is a big bump for that rotation. And they got him at a really good rate too. Like, it's getting blown out of the water because Pete is a homegrown guy. The fans love him. We love him. There's no doubt about that. I think we know that Pete is awesome. But at the same time, there's no reason to rush and just trust the guy who's at the helm.
Absolutely. And, I'm thinking about this team as a whole right now, pitching aside, because I do feel the pitching is a whole lot weaker.
Yes.
Definitely on paper, I thought it was better last year as well. They still can make some moves in the bullpen. We saw super bullpen be made in Los Angeles, help them win the World Series. So that's something that can happen. When you look at this Mets lineup, you basically have just replaced Pete Alonso with Juan Soto, who's 5 years younger and is a better all-around offensive player. And you still kind of have the same lineup. So you're hoping for Marc Vientos to not have that kind of sophomore-ish slump, even though he's not a sophomore. But, first time being in a starting role for the second straight year. You have Alvey coming back off of an injury, Nimmo as well, who, has had injuries of his own. And they have scored a lot of runs. even with the struggles last year, they had scored a lot of runs. So maybe the Mets are a few games better offensively, a few runs better, with Soto, if for some reason they don't add on to this offense.
Yeah, I think that's another thing too, is that the offense has gotten better. It would be really good if Pete came back. It would be really good if we were able to fill one of the first and or third base holes, depending on where Vientos is going to play and whatnot. But at the end of the day, this Mets team, I think, is a lot better than people give it credit for. I think sometimes, like, I've seen a lot of like the betting over unders on wins. Like, I think those are crazy, putting us at like 92, 93 right now. Like, I don't think the current version of the Mets team that's a great line by any means, but Francisco Lindor is great. Like you mentioned, I think Nimmo having his plantar fasciitis that he had last year, like, clearly played a lot into what was going on, because he had such an amazing first half. He should have been
90 RBIs.
Yeah, should have been an all-star. Like, we thought the Brandon Nimmo, like, true getting to that next level was happening, and then the injury stuff kind of added on. But like, there are rooms for this team to still improve, along with the fact that there is a guy named Juan Soto in this lineup. I would love to bring Pete back. I really still hope we do. But if he is wanting these astronomical numbers, we can play that waiting game there, because you're not getting it. There's no way. Pete Alonso shouldn't be the highest paid first baseman ever. There's no way. There's no way.
And this all started with Jesse Winker signing. So
Yes.
I want to get into Jesse Winker right now, because this is where this all stems. Earlier on in the day, it was Andy Martino who came, obviously pending the physical, that he was going to be resigning with the Mets. Joel Sherman had it 1 year, $7.5 million, with a chance to reach $9 million via bonuses. Jesse Winker last season with the Mets, .243 batting average, 3 homers, 13 RBI, 683 OPS when he got traded. But I mean, he had a great postseason. Had a couple of big triples in the postseason, a mammoth home run against Philadelphia. And I've said this many times in the past, for the reasons I want to bring him back is, and I know this doesn't go as much into it, but the guy brings a gritty toughness to the team that was really lacking from, I want to say, around 2020 to 2023. A positive clubhouse presence, and obviously will serve in that kind of similar role as the DH outfielder off the bench. Are you were in line with them bringing back Jesse Winker?
Yeah, I think especially on the contract they gave him, super reasonable, super fair. I didn't want to do necessarily multi-years with Jesse Winker or give him a lot of money, because he's a DH at the end of the day. We know he can't really play the outfield very well, but he does give the Mets an edge, and that's something, like you mentioned, they've missed for so long, and it's something that I've been screaming and yelling about for years, where it's like, we, for a while, were like way too nice. We had a bunch of nice guys that were good on and off the field. Like, there was no edge to this team. And while Jesse Winker, I think, is still a nice guy at his core, he brings edge on the field. He does the bat flips. He hits home runs. He was screaming at Willie Adames going around the bases. Like, those are the kind of things that also help pick up a team when they're down in a slump, when they need a little bit of like pep in their step. You got a guy like Jesse Winker going. He can also get scalding hot, like we saw in the postseason. Like, when he is locked in, he's a 30% better than league average hitter that we've seen at times in his career. So I love the move. I love bringing him back. I think the DH spot being handled how it is kind of a more revolving door, is a good decision. He's a good left-handed bat facing right-handed pitching. And then it seems like Marte will maybe be the guy facing a lot of the lefties in those games. So I like what David Stearns is doing there. High on base guy too.
Do you see that outfield locked in as it is right now? You got Nimmo and obviously Soto are the two on the corner. You got Taylor as well as Siri in center. Marte could obviously play outfield in a pinch, as well as Jesse Winker. Do you see that obviously Nimmo and Soto aren't going anywhere, but could you see any trades happening? There was talk about Marte possibly being traded for some relief help. Or you think they're going to stay as is with the way that those guys are?
I mean, I would love for the Mets to continue to look at how to improve center field. Jose Siri is a great defensive player, but I think, like, as a well-rounded player, you're not going to say that ever about Jose Siri unless for some reason the bat really does wake up. This will never happen. I want Luis Robert. Like, that's the guy I'd go after, but there's no real sign that the White Sox are going to move him right now, and the Mets would have to give up a ton. I think at the end of the day, the only thing that might change is that Starling Marte gets moved. I know Mike Puma, I think, put out that the Mets have told Marte that they would look to trade him to a place where he would have a better situation. And I think that's going to be tough because the money he's owed and the fact that he was one of the worst defensive outfielders in baseball last year really is not helping the selling value of him. So I don't know what the Mets could even do if anybody even wants that. But if you're able to move Marte, I think that's the clear and obvious choice. It frees up money. And honestly, if you can even get back like a cheap reliever who maybe has options left and goes up and down, it's worth it just to clear the money for a guy who's a little bit redundant right now on this roster.
Quite possibly a guy, too, that could be traded at the deadline if he has a good start to the season. He had a pretty solid postseason as well. Came up with a lot of clutch hits. When I go back to Winker and a couple of comments that have been thrown in here, because the talk was after signing Winker that was kind of the pivot from, Pete Alonso, is that it's going to be Winker. But I don't think so. I think that there's still a chance that they get another hitter here, whether it's Alonso or someone else. I mean, I know the news came out last week that Anthony Santander could possibly take a short-term deal. And, he's played first base. And there's, Jurickson Profar, who's played first base as well. To you, and I got some, comments here, Winker isn't the only bat the Mets will get. Carlos Ramos saying that's not the reason that they signed Winker. That's not the pivot. That's just the first move of a pivot. What do you think of, how they are pivoting from Pete? And if they don't bring back Pete, what is the next move that you would like to see them make?
Yeah, I don't think that Jesse Winker really does have any impact on Pete. I think it's kind of fun wordplay for all the reporters and even the Mets to leak out there of like, hey, Jesse Winker means no Pete Alonso, that they're moving on. Even if you read what Andy Martino said, it talks about that the Mets right now feel that it's more likely that Pete Alonso will sign somewhere else than it is with the Mets. And that makes sense based on all the info that we've been getting over the last couple hours. But I still think there's at least one more bat left on this team that they got to improve. There still is a hole on one of the corners of the infield. Like, as much as I believe in Brett Beatty and Ronnie Mauricio as guys that I think could be valuable assets to this team in 2025, I'd love for them to not have the pressure of needing to be valuable assets for this team starting on opening day. So maybe they take a look at Nolan Arenado again. Like, we know he's on the block. We know the Mets are one of the 8 teams that he put on the list that he'd allow to be traded to. Maybe you grab him to play third base if the Cardinals take some of that money. Maybe you look at a Jurickson Profar who can also play corner outfield. There are a lot of options out there, and I think the Mets will check every single rock. They won't leave one unturned.
Brad saying moving Vientos to first, then moving him again next year doesn't make sense. I really wanted him to get settled in at third base. I thought he did a very admirable job playing out there. But if Alonso doesn't return, it's probably the most logical decision to move him to first base. And like you said, and like Deep posts up here, to have guys like Beatty, Acuna, as well as Ronnie Mauricio, who I don't think is going to be ready. I think it was Mike Puma today who posted that he is still, not in game shape and game form. So they don't even know if he'll be ready for opening day. I'm not counting on it. So I think it's going to be Beatty or Acuna. Maybe they throw Jeff McNeil at third base. I don't know how they're going to handle this, but it does seem like a lot. The worst case scenario is probably them staying in-house.
Yeah, and I think to the thing about Vientos switching between first and third and going back, I think truthfully at the end of the day, until Marc Vientos shows us he has the ability to be a better defensive third baseman, you kind of can't work. Like, the idea of him going back, he might not ever go back, guys. Like, he might just not be a good defensive third baseman. I'm going to trust Marc Vientos because of the improvement that we saw in his offensive game, the fact that he is a hard worker, that he can improve at the position. But there's a very real possibility that Marc Vientos is a first base DH player moving forward for the Mets in the next 3-4 seasons. So it doesn't bother me that much moving him to first base by any means, because it might be the best position for him. The Mets might be a better team with Marc Vientos at first base than they are with him at third base. I think that's a total possibility. So to me, I want whatever is going to be the best scenario for the Mets to win as many baseball games as possible. And that's why we have David Stearns yet again. It's like signing Jesse Winker for the DH spot. Perfect. Beautiful. Crush right-handed pitching. Be our DH. Be a vibes guy. Vientos moves to first. Maybe we get a third baseman. That probably makes us a better team. Like, Pete's awesome. Those guys are great. But at the end of the day, it's about winning baseball games. It's not about homegrown guys and breaking records.
Yeah, and all you hear is it's because we've seen once the Yankees start making a whole flurry of moves, Once the Dodgers start
Yes.
making their moves, it's like, okay, what are the Mets going to do? And all you hear is, oh, they signed Soto. They spent all this much on Soto. They don't have enough money to do anything else. But I really think outside of Soto, which was Cohen desperately wanting Soto and giving him whatever possible to get him here, every other move, the Mets have gotten every deal I think that they've wanted, and that even includes in arbitration as well. Every move that they've made, they've made out. Whereas in the past, under the Wilpon era, they would overpay and it just wouldn't work out. I think Stearns has done a great job when it comes to that.
Yeah, just because we have a lot of money doesn't mean we should be spending it like drunken sailors. We kind of did with Soto. He's a different player. This organization seems very focused on when the opportunity is there, we take our shot. Soto was that guy. We even saw it in the past with Scherzer and Verlander, and that was before Stearns. But like when they feel like there are these big name players, they're going to take their shots. Obviously, the old 40-year-olds didn't work out, but they haven't really gotten crazy with dudes who haven't seemed to be worth it, which that's a really reassuring thing. Because like, as you said, with the Mets in the past, I mean, there's no $10 million contracts being given out to Frank Francisco and John Roush.
Oh yeah. Those days I'm happy are long gone and over. Yeah. Armand in the chat, bringing up a guy that I didn't even think about. Do the Tigers come into play for a possible trade for Torkelson?
I think with no Pete, totally a possibility, because it seems like Torkelson's getting pushed out of there, especially with signing Glaber. They're going to move Colt Keith, it seems like, to first base, and it seems like they might be kind of just done with Torque. I would love to take a flyer on Spencer Torkelson. I was a huge fan of his in college, coming out of the draft. He's too good of a hitter to be as bad as he has. I don't know what the problem is, because at times you watch, he's got great plate discipline, and then at times he forgets how to hit and refuses to swing at pitches in the strike zone. Maybe he just needs a change of scenery. He's kind of our Brett Beatty.
The only other name that has been talked about is Vladdy Guerrero Jr.
Yeah.
And if that's a possibility, which I don't think right now that they are going to be willing to trade him. I think even if they were to sign Pete Alonso, I think that they would try to give it a go this season and see what they have. And if they could make a run here, that maybe at the deadline, just like what happened in Washington when they sent Soto to San Diego, I think they're going to want the most prospects possible for a guy like Vladimir Guerrero Jr., and they'll probably get it.
Yeah, I mean, he's a phenomenal hitter. I would love for him to be the first baseman for the Mets of the future, just because that bat is unbelievable. And he's 25 years old. He's so young. So him and Soto would be right next to each other in the lineup for the next 10 years, which would be a pretty sick, 2-3-3-4 punch right there. But yeah, I want to drink the Kool-Aid and think that if they were to get Pete, that means they're going to move on from Vlad, but it's definitely more likely that they actually probably go for it a little bit harder, because they're like, this is our 1 year. Let's take our shot.
I have a suggestion, or I guess a question from Anthony Viola. What would be the perfect Vladdy trade package the Mets could offer?
So apparently they want more than what Juan Soto got from the Yankees, from the Padres last year, which to me, that feels crazy to get more than Juan Soto got, because Juan Soto's a better player. But you'd be looking at like a combination of Jet Williams, Brandon Sproat, maybe even like a Jonah Tong or a Nolan McLean a little bit further down the line, but with some upside. I think they'd be interested in a Clifford type or a Jesus Baez. The guys who are exciting, legit prospects in this organization, we're not going to fool them with any of the guys that we don't want. So like, I don't think those guys would make the move, but anybody who has some legitimate ceiling, I think the Blue Jays would be knocking on the door. I don't think we're going to be able to move Tyler McGill in this trade to get, Vlad Jr. type thing.
I feel like it would have to be Sproat, Tidwell, like probably both of them have to be in that package.
I think at least, yeah.
Right? You're talking about maybe even Clifford and a Drew Gilbert. Like there's going to be top names a part of this. So
yeah.
Are the Mets at this point willing to, dive into 4 or 5 players in their top 10? And we're talking the higher end of the top 10 to get a guy like Vlad Jr. To me, you'd have to almost try to sign him immediately, kind of like they did with Francisco Lindor. Whatever you want, have it.
Yeah, you'd have to hope that you could do that. And even in the Lindor trade, Mets still didn't even give up as much as what the Blue Jays seemingly want for Vlad Jr. So it's a crazy game that the Blue Jays are playing. But similarly to how the Mets hold all the power here with Pete Alonso, the Blue Jays don't have to trade Vlad Jr. at all. They can let him walk. That's a stupid decision, because I think that roster stinks. But they don't have to trade him just because we all know that roster is bad.
Yeah, no, yeah. They don't have to trade him at all. And I don't think he gets traded at the beginning of the season. I really think that if, let's say, they land a guy like Pete Alonso, or, even, go in and try to get Alex Brett. I don't know who they always are into somebody.
Still up there for Roki still. They haven't been
Yep.
knocked out yet. So if they get Roki, all of a sudden you're looking at that team a little differently.
Yep. And I think they'll try to make one last run that they can with Vladdy, at least up to the trade deadline, if it's working for them. Irtzer Abba says, is Bregman still a possibility at this point? And I bring this up because Bob Nightingale of USA Today said that Bregman is still looking for a long-term deal. So for me, I think that the Mets are totally out on that. I think that's a pipe dream.
Yeah, I think it would have to be, like, again, a 3-year with opt-outs. I think there's no shot they go past 3 years on a Bregman deal right now.
They also were talking about, and there was Andy Martino, I mentioned it earlier, about pivoting to possible bullpen. And even Will Salmon was talking about this as well. The top name for me, and I think for everybody, is Tanner Scott. Fits so many needs that the Mets have, whether it's being a lefty out of the bullpen, which the Mets have not had, with Brooks Raley being out. A guy that can possibly close when in need, when Edwin Diaz needs to be spelled for a day, or he comes in the 6th inning trying to get out Schwarber. So they need a guy like Tanner Scott. I know he's going to be a lot of money, but if you're pivoting from Pete Alonso's big contract, Tanner Scott might be that guy.
Yeah, I definitely am in the minority of Mets fans where Tanner Scott helps this team. I'll never argue that. He's a good pitcher. I'd love to have him in the bullpen. But I don't go from the standpoint that the Mets necessarily need Tanner Scott, just because there are cheaper options that I think are going to be able to get similar type of value out of Tanner Scott. Like, he still is a guy who walks 13-14% of the batters he faced. And that is a huge concern that a lot of Mets fans have with this bullpen, is how many walks we had last year. If you compare his K to walk ratios with Reed Garrett last season, and Reed Garrett doesn't get lefties out, so that's a little bit different. But the idea is that K to walk wise, they're similar in terms of their rates. I think Reed Garrett actually had a higher K rate, lower walk rate than Tanner Scott, which feels insane. I like David Robertson. That's the one that I have circled. I want David Robertson back. We know he can pitch in New York. Similarly, has that closer experience, stepped up huge for us when Edwin Diaz went down. He'd be an amazing set of men. And because of his pitch repertoire with that cutter, he is locked down against lefties. Like, his splits last year and for his career in general, lefties have fits with David Robertson. So to me, a cheaper option, because I truly think Tanner Scott's still asking probably for that 3-4 year deal at around $20 million a year. That's too rich for my blood for a relief pitcher when we already have one on the line for $20 million a season. If Tanner Scott wants a 2 for $30 million, I'd consider it a lot more than the length that he's wanting, because he is a good pitcher. But I think there's this is me being, a David Stearns fanboy. There's different ways to make this bullpen valuable without committing even more money to another arm that truthfully pitches one inning every 2 to 3 games. Like, I get scared giving relievers that much money. Even Edwin, like, I love Edwin. $20 million is so much money to a closer.
Yeah, David Robertson. I've always loved David Robertson, even when he was here last season. It sucked that we didn't get to see him and Edwin Diaz go back to back. So it would be nice to do that now. But we're also looking at a guy that's 40 years old. Like,
he is old,
how long is he going to be able to maintain his repertoire and the way he pitches? You are, even though he's 40, you're willing to give him, you said 2-year deal?
No, I'd give him a 1-year deal. I think he's a 1-year deal guy, David Robertson, and probably in like that $7 to $10 million range. I think last year he signed for about $10 million with the Rangers. So even if it's a repeat of that, I'd be down for 110 for David Robertson, just because that really does lengthen out this bullpen, just like Tanner Scott would. Again, Tanner Scott, great. It's just a money thing to me, and I would rather have $10 million committed this year to David Robertson than $30 million over 2 years, or the worst case scenario is like 80 over 4 for Tanner Scott, which I've seen some stuff thrown out, or 4 for 60. That's just too many years and too much money for a reliever.
And the Mets could probably get David Robertson and maybe, was it a Kirby Yates or AJ Minter?
Totally.
AJ Minter's also lefty.
Tim Hill's out there. Listen, if
Hill.
Brooks Raley arm still works, I'd love to bring Brooks Raley back. Like, he was so awesome with the Mets when he was healthy. I'm a huge Brooks Raley guy. There's so many ways to get creative with the bullpen, and we saw David Stearns do such a great job with it last year, where opening day bullpen didn't look anything like it did on the last day of the season. I think that's the way that modern teams should focus on the bullpen and will focus on the bullpen. The Dodgers, a lot of the guys that they had were reclamation projects. A lot of the guys were not these, let's pay $20 million a year. They had that guy with Kenley Jansen. They let him walk, and it was one of the best decisions they've made.
Johnny K saying, I definitely want Scott, but I like Tim Hill too if there's room. Yeah, I was looking at Tim Hill, and I'm like, everyone will say, oh, this is just another Yankee, but he had a good second half with the Yankees.
He's great, yeah.
I want players that can play here.
Yes.
And if Tim Hill can pitch in New York, we saw it with Clay Holmes, bringing in Clay Holmes. They brought in Luis Severino, Harrison Bader. I mean, I don't mind taking Yankees. If they could play in New York, why not?
Yeah,
why
literally,
not take a flyer?
I simply do not care. I hate to say this, but the Yankees win a lot. Why would we not want some of their players if they want to come play for us? And they're good. That's the other thing. In the past, we've taken Yankee players like Kareem Garcia. That's one of the names that sticks out in my head. He was a loser. He stunk. Like, he was on the end of his career. We're like, Kareem Garcia, that's the guy we're bringing in 04. Like, these are good players that will help this team win. So I don't care where they come from. They could be Phillies. They could be Braves. Doesn't matter to me.
It also reminds me of Shane Spencer on his last legs, bringing the Mets, bringing him in 2004.
Horrible.
Unbelievable. Looking at some more of these comments, Jacob Deli saying thoughts on the Mets pitching. Now, you mentioned the Mets not being getting in on the Roki Sasaki. He's picked his three teams: Padres, Dodgers, and Toronto. Of all things, I never thought that was in play. But with Roki Sasaki being out of it now, do you see the Mets getting in on any other starting pitching? You think they're set? I mean, the guy from the Dodgers is still available now that his name is out of my head. I can't think. He beat the Mets pretty well.
Jack Flaherty.
Flaherty. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Jack Flaherty's out there, and he has even, thought about taking a short-term deal. May worth, inquiring about, I think.
Yeah, I think depends on price with Jack Flaherty. He's a guy who I think was not as bad as he was the year before, where he had a near 5 ERA, and I don't think he was as good as we saw at times last year. I think he's right in the middle, a guy who's high 3, low 4 ERA, can give you some innings, solid pitcher with some upside. So I wouldn't hate signing Jack Flaherty, but yeah, if he wants a 1-year deal, I'm all in on going after a guy like Jack Flaherty on 1 year, just because he has the ability to be pretty good, and that's something that the Mets could use. But at the end of the day, I don't think the Mets are going to really be very aggressive on the pitching market. I think if they see a deal that they like, they will take their shot. But truthfully, I think they're going to be more aggressive on the trade market come midseason, come trade deadline. I think that's really where they're looking to strike.
And I'm sure you will hear the same names we've heard this offseason:
Yep.
Luis Castillo, Dylan Cease. So I'm pretty sure the Mets will, like you said, they'll be in on it. And David Stearns has already kind of given us a little outlook into how he handles the trade deadline. That was one of the things that worried me about Billy Epler when he was here, when he didn't strike in 2022, when they had the opportunity. And maybe it was for the best because we kept Mark Vientos and Beatty and Alvarez, but him not doing that kind of hurt the Mets in their playoff run, and they ended up fizzling out. 2023 changed the direction of the team, going for the minor leaguers and trading off the dead contracts. But you had David Stearns here. He was able to bring in guys that helped this team down the stretch. When you look at Jesse Winker, Phil Maton was great up until the postseason, and it was kind of the reverse for Stanek, where Stanek had the awful start but was lights out in the postseason. That's another guy I didn't even think about to bring back for the bullpen. But I really do, having full trust in what David Stearns could possibly do here, when it comes to the trade deadline.
Yeah, it's a super uncomfortable feeling as a Mets fan to just trust the front office, because we've had such ineptitude over the last at least 29 years of my life. So I get why people are not trusting in what goes on up there, but this is a different guy. And I think the deadline that he had last year, like you said, is exactly what you can expect from David Stearns. If the right player's there, he'll make the moves, but otherwise he is trying to fill out this roster and make sure that not just the 26 men on the major league roster, but the 40-man roster has guys available so that he can move these pitchers up and down too if he has to.
Yeah, it's good to have the depth, right? I mean,
Yes,
all
so good.
everyone getting up. I keep bringing it up, but all these names that we're hearing them sign that are not the top names, we're definitely going to see them shuttled
Oh,
at some point up,
yes.
and you need guys that you can shuttle up here and be able to release as well. I
Yep.
mean, you don't want to have to release one of your, top guys when you can bring in some guy off the crap heap and plug him in for a day and then release them, and maybe they'll come back because no one else wants to sign them. It just worked so well for them. Uh, and the pitching staff did eventually, get tired out at the end of the season. You want to avoid that. So
Yeah.
bring as much depth as possible.
Oh yeah, I can't wait to see Justin Hagenman pitching in July against the Phillies in the game or something like that. It's going to be it's the chaos bullpen, and it worked last year. I think whether people want to admit it or not, it worked. I'm down to roll the dice again. And guess what? If it doesn't work, relievers are the easiest thing to acquire. The easiest thing. Teams are always on roster crunches. Relievers are always the first to get the axe. You will be able to find guys to fill in.
And you'll see them as well before the season begins when
Yep.
they do roster crunches. So
Yep.
there's a possibility that the Mets pick up players that way as well.
Yeah, no, totally. They've been so purposefully aggressive after the guys that they go after that if someone is made available that makes sense, I fully trust they'll be going for him.
Game for War disagrees. He says Stearns failed at the trade deadline last year. In his opinion, he failed to get us relief for the playoffs besides Stanek. If not for Budo saving us, we would have been screwed. I think that, yes, Budo pretty much saved a lot of the bullpen, but because of that, we lost him in the postseason.
Yes.
The fact that he had to come in, pitch 2 or 3 innings a game because a lot of the pitchers were unreliable. And once the Daniel Nunez got hurt, you were seeing him way too often, and he could not hold himself to pitching every other day. He had to be brought in every 3 days. And that's why in the postseason, after that really good game he had, I think it was game 1 or game 2 where he pitched 2 innings.
Yes, he was
fine.
awesome.
Yeah, they brought him in the next day, which he's not used to. And that kind of set the tone for him not being able to pitch, for the rest of the way.
I also think the narrative of that the bullpen failed in the playoffs is so interesting because they failed against the Dodgers. The Dodgers are really good. Like if you look at the bullpen numbers for what happened in the NLDS, Reed Garrett had 2 2/3 innings, 0 runs allowed. Phil Maton stunk in the playoffs, but he was great in the regular season. Got us there. Like we don't make the playoffs without Phil Maton. Even a guy like Ryan Stanek, I know he stepped up in the playoffs, but he was great. Jose Budo was great. I don't know how many amazing arms are they truly looking for. There aren't many bullpens out there that can do it. And by the way, the team that we beat with the Phillies, Jeff Hoffman was one of the best relievers in baseball last year. He imploded. Relief pitching is volatile. I understand the process of trying to have as many good arms as possible, and I'm all about it. But there's no reason to overpay because just as volatilely bad and they could also be, wow, look at these. Daniel Nunez was a nobody. And I'm so excited to watch him pitch in 2025 because of what we saw. He was fantastic. I can't wait to see who that guy's going to be this year, the out-of-nowhere name. Maybe that's Sean Reed-Foley this season. He was great when he was in relief last year.
And this is why the Mets and Stearns are bringing in all these, name relievers. If you remember, the first half of the season was Reed Garrett.
Yep.
He was overused
He was
so much. Nobody. He was overused so much till the point he got hurt. Then we had the point in time where Edwin Diaz got caught with the sticky stuff and he got hurt. So you're relying on Budos and the Daniel Nunez of the world, and they get hurt. I mean, it's a constant rotation all season long of these guys. So you have to kind of be patient with these relievers and hope that at some point it works out. Just it so happens for the Dodgers that all their guys were healthy, I think, except for Joe Kelly. And it all worked out for them. And you mentioned the Phillies; they had 2 of the best relievers: Hoffman, Strom. I mean, they imploded.
Was great too. Yeah, they had a really good bullpen, and they got hit. Sometimes, even if you have the best bullpen, it doesn't work out. Sometimes when you have a bad bullpen, it does work out. It's bizarre. And even when you look at how the Dodgers built their bullpen, Blake Treinen, a lot of injuries, was pretty cheap. Evan Phillips got hurt in the World Series, so he wasn't able to pitch. He's been a lockdown guy, but he was another reclamation project. Michael Kopech was one of the worst relievers in baseball a year ago. He switches organizations. He's one of the best in the league. So I think as long as the Mets continue to show this development and this ability to find these arms for cheap and find these guys, Mets fans, I think, will start to get more and more trust in, like, I mean, I love seeing when they signed Austin Warren and you get like the David Stearns masterclass stuff, because at some point it's going to actually be true where Mets fans are like, this isn't a joke. This is actually probably going to be a guy who gets some big outs for us at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan, 38 years a Mets fan. They don't fool me anymore. I never get my hopes up after almost 4 decades of left downs. Honestly, that's honestly the best way to be. Don't let baseball treat you this way. I mean, if the Mets come through, there's only one team that can win the World Series every year.
Yeah.
And we haven't seen a dynasty since the Yankees run from 98 to 2000. So
yeah,
outside of maybe the Giants kind of winning it every other year for those 3 years that they did, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, the thing that, like, I don't know, I keep saying this, but like in terms of making the playoffs, this is like one of the most successful stretches in Mets history. They don't really make the playoffs too often. And at least in my lifetime, they've made it more than they have in like any other stretch. Like, obviously, we don't have a World Series win, and that's what I want. And this is a little bit of loser talk, but I'm all for getting my hopes up. This is why I watch baseball. It is fun to me. It is exciting. When they let me down, if they let me down, all right, I'll be upset for like whatever period of time it is. But at the end of the day, like, baseball's pretty awesome. The Mets are really good. This is not a typical Mets team where people are getting themselves worked up for nothing. Like, there are things to be excited about with this organization in 2025. Enjoy it. Have some fun. I think we all had a little fun with Grimace, and look what happened. The team got hot. I think we need to have a little bit more of a positive outlook sometimes.
Baseball Fantasy Podcast saying Kirby Yates is the only relief pitcher that they want. Awesome stuff. And at his age, he will be a 1-year deal contract that goes along in the line still with, David Robertson. If you give me a combination of David Robertson, Kirby Yates, or AJ Minter, I think I'm solid when it comes to the bullpen. And then you add that to Budo and Nunez, and I'm pretty sure you're going to rotate Canning and Clay Holmes to be long guys. I think that the formula here is starting to work for the Mets. And that, obviously, Kodai Senga has to stay healthy.
Yes.
We need another solid season from Sean Manaea. And if you get anything of what we got from David Peterson last year, who was probably the best pitcher on the team.
It's awesome.
I mean, even in the postseason, coming in relief, you get anything like that, I mean, you're pretty much set.
Yeah, no, I think the way that this team is built is scary to Mets fans, and I get it. But I think you have to look at what happened last year, and you got to look at where these guys have been heading. I love the direction. Like, Peterson is maybe one of the more slept-on pitchers right now in this entire Mets rotation. I don't love to use wins, but when he pitched last year, the Mets won baseball games. That's huge, just being able to keep the team in the game like he was. And you mentioned coming up big in the postseason. He was awesome. He was huge. Got major outs, stepped up big when we needed him. He's someone who I'm really looking forward to 2025 as hopefully a breakout season for him. I think at the end of the day, he is a middle to back end of the rotation starter. But if there's ever a year that it would happen where David Peterson is able to take that step forward, a year off of the hip surgery that he had that clearly seems like had an effect on him, I'd love to see what a healthy season of full spring training of David Peterson can do.
Yeah, some nice consistency from him. So every so often we get, 2022 is a good season for him.
Yes.
When he came up in 2020, it's like every other year we get some good. So to get some consistency out of him would be perfect. John Smith saying offer Bregman 5 for 130, take it or leave it. I think he would leave that on the table.
I think
honestly.
he'd leave that too.
Right?
Yeah, 5 for 130 gives him what does that come out to money wise? That's like $26 million a year. He's probably leaving that. I'll say this, I don't really want the Mets to do that either. I don't really want to give Bregman 5 years at $26 million a season.
Yeah, he's looking definitely for, I think they said probably 6 to 7 years.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to be tied down on him. I'd rather give Pete the deal that he wants.
Yes.
Than to deal with Bregman and take that long-term deal. That's not something that I would be interested in doing. Jacob Deli asking thoughts on our catcher, Francisco Alvarez, on him not being able to throw runners out.
I mean, listen, part of it is also on the pitchers too. Our pitchers did a horrendous job holding on runners, like a lot of the times. And if you look at how catcher stuff is broken down, like Alvarez by no means was great defensively. throwing out runners. He's great framing and otherwise. Luis Torrens was awesome at throwing guys out, but the pitchers have not done a great job of holding on the runners either. Francisco Alvarez is also 22, 23 years old. This is something he can improve on. And guess what? If he hits like we expect him to, they could run all day on him. I couldn't care less. Like, stolen bases are awesome, but if you have, like, the way that the Mets defense is and the way the Mets pitchers are, we're striking so many guys out, it kind of almost gets neutralized a little bit, especially when you have the strikeouts, because those guys aren't being hit home. I don't think that was one of the main issues for the Mets team last year, honestly.
And they also made it easier with the new rules
Yes.
on stealing bases. I mean, Ricky Henderson probably could have stole like 300 or 400 bases last season with the rules that they have now. And then you got, it doesn't help when you have Adam Ottavino on the mound and he's not being able to hold runners on. So,
like, the thing I'll say with Francisco Alvarez, it's all about pop time, right? Like, stealing bases it's a numbers game, which sounds insane, but truthfully, if you can get to second base quicker than the catcher can throw the ball to second base, you're going to steal the base. It doesn't matter. So Alvarez last year among catchers was 16th in pop time. It's like pretty good. That's a really solid range. Luis Torrens was 5th. So you're talking about, like, the Mets have 2 better than average guys in terms of pop time. Obviously, the accuracy of throws can change things, and maybe Alvarez needs to work a little bit there because he does have throws tail on him and fly up or go a little bit out of control sometimes. But I think the narrative that he has a problem throwing guys out is a little bit overblown sometimes. Like, he's not Travis Darnell.
No. And I think that the bigger concern with him in the backstop is his ability to not be able to stop a wild pitch. I think that his setup is a little bit more of the concern to me because obviously he sits on one knee and he's unable to, block. Keith Hernandez and Ron Darn, they all bring it up during the broadcast of the way he sets himself that we saw so many wild pitches.
Yeah. And I was never a catcher at a high level like these guys, but like catching was my position. That was my favorite thing. It is crazy to me to see guys catching major league pitching in that position. But I think right now, with the fact that you can still steal strikes on framing, that has a lot to do with it. It is focused on stealing the strikes rather than the wild pitches. Because truthfully, I wonder how many actual wild pitches happen while guys are on base, as opposed to just like in general in a game. Because if no one's on base, who cares if the ball bounces away? If a guy's on second, if a guy's on third, obviously that changes things. Alvarez was arguably the worst at blocking last year in terms of blocks above average. He was 65th out of 66 catchers. Has to work on it there. But that, a lot of the times, is an effort thing too. And it's not that he isn't trying hard, but the idea, like, mentally of how to block baseballs, getting your body around it, being active, he's so focused on stealing strikes that I think right now his mind is just not quick enough to be able to recognize that the pitch is going to bounce rather than trying to steal the strike.
You also got to factor in his hand as well. The injury with the hand and
totally makes a difference on both things. It made such a huge difference on his entire game last year. A healthy Alvarez, I think, really can reach the levels that we expect one day.
Yeah, it took him until late into September to kind of get the power stroke back. And then you saw in the last couple of games against the Dodgers, he was starting to hit well again.
Yep.
So we know he's a streaky hitter, but I expect a lot better from what we saw from him more in 2023 than what we got from him this year. Danny Dom saying, as of right now, do the Mets have enough to be competitive with the top teams in both leagues? I think they do, definitely in the American League, right?
They'd be the best American League team in baseball. Yeah.
I feel like the American League is so weak, but when you look in the National League, you got obviously the 3 teams out west who've been making big moves: Dodgers, Padres, and Diamondbacks, who they only missed by a half game, not making or percentage points, obviously, that they couldn't get. And then you have the Braves and the Phillies.
Yeah, like right now, none of the teams in the Central worry me at all. And I know that maybe his famous last words, but until they do anything, I'm not worried about them. The Mets are totally competitive with all these teams. It's everyone's chasing the Dodgers. They're in the league of their own. Everyone else is relatively in that same glut.
Tio316 is saying, yeah, Acuna is a stud and he's going to be huge. And that follows up with Jason saying Acuna has a unique swing. I can definitely see how he can end up being a star in a different way than his brother, but still a star in his own way. We got this a nice little sample size, about 2-week sample size of him. He actually filled in very nicely for Francisco Lindor. So clutch.
So big.
What are your thoughts on Acuna this season? You think he's going to be a big part of this team with the way that obviously this infield is set up currently? And, with not knowing if Pete's gone for good or not.
Is it crazy to say that? So I'll phrase this differently. I think he has a good chance to make a big impact on this team. I want him to make a big impact on this team, but I don't want him to have to make a big impact on this team.
Yeah.
I would love for Jeff McNeil to bounce back and show us the player that he used to be, because that was a guy who is a super valuable hitter at the plate for us. If he's going to hit 15 homers and hit around 300, that's huge for us. That'd be amazing. I don't want a lot of pressure put on Luis Angel Acuna. This is something that we've preached on our podcast, Mets Up, for as soon as they got him. Stop comparing him to his brother. It is a last name. There's nothing similar. He will never be even as close to as good as Ronald Acuna Jr. It's not possible. But the kind of player that he is, the kind of energy he brings, he hits the ball really hard, and he started to hit it in the air last year a little bit more, which is great. He doesn't strike out. Now, he also doesn't walk, but he does a lot of really things well, and he is also still a baby. He's 22, 23 years old next season. Tons of promise in this player. I just don't want there to be really any weight on his shoulders more than there already is.
And that's what happened in 2022 when the Mets brought up, Vientos and Beatty and even Alvarez for the last series against Atlanta. I mean, that's probably not the right spot for them to be coming up and putting that much pressure on them. So, Acuna getting the opportunity, whether it's, at third, he could play a little bit of outfield, play second base. Maybe they move Jeff McNeil and figure out a way to get him in the lineup. We'll see. We'll definitely see what happens. Kevin Fox is talking about adding 2 bats with Alonso leaving. He's talking about signing Santander, which we already talked about earlier on. But what about a trade for a guy like Yandy Diaz? I keep hearing his name being floated around.
I'd love to take a shot on Yandy. If he is available and the Mets are not going to be going after Pete Alonso, I think Yandy is a really interesting player. He's an on-base machine. He hits the ball hard. He is going to be really bad defensively at first base. Like, Pete at least has his scoops. I don't think Yandy really has anything going on for him defensively, but he mashes. He's not going to hit the home runs like Pete, just because he doesn't hit the ball in the air that much, but he doesn't strike out. He walks a ton, hits the ball hard, gets on base. Those are all things that work really well in a lineup that has Juan Soto and Francisco Lindor and Marc Vientos in it.
Same vintage, bringing up another name. I'd sign Ty France as a backup if Vientos is starting at first base. What are your thoughts on Ty France?
I'm kind of done with Ty France. He was the baseball savant darling like a couple years ago when he had his breakout, but his numbers have been really bad, He doesn't hit the ball very hard anymore. The barrel rates are really poor. He's not really walking that much. He's striking out more. He's a player who, in a pinch, sure, if he wants to play a couple weeks at first base because of an injury, that's fine. So maybe backup's not the worst thing. Maybe you have a point there with him being a backup guy, but I don't know. I would not feel great if the Mets were like, Ty France, you're our guy. You're going to be the backup in case anything goes wrong with Vientos.
Mark, before we wrap up the show, final take on how this, off season wraps up. Is Pete gone for good in your eyes?
Pete Alonso is not gone for good until he's gone for good. Until he signs for another team, the Mets are still going to be considering Pete Alonso as a first base option. And I think Pete Alonso will still continue to consider the Mets as a team because there's not many other options. So until he signs with someone else, I am not buying that the Mets are completely moving on. And they're looking at other options. This is part of negotiations. This is how you do it. You got to make Pete sweat a little bit more than you have. All right, let's see what you got, Pete. Let's see how strong you are. Let's see how big they are.
I mean, how many contentious, negotiations have we seen? Like, we've seen this so many times before, and it all gets put out in the media. You got John Heyman with Scott Boras, and you got, all these different media outlets saying where he's going to sign, what the money is. To me, honestly, I still like you. I still think there is a way that he signs until he's off the board. I still think he's coming back.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like there's really any other option, truthfully.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show in such a pinch, such short time, considering all the news that has happened today. Let everyone know what you're working on and hit up your social media.
Sure, yeah. If you like baseball content in general, you can check out all my Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Giraffe Neck Marc, as you see on screen. And then if you like Mets content, do a podcast with James Shiano called Mets Up. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on Spotify, Google, all that kind of stuff. And we do a couple episodes a week, sometimes a little bit more, and just love baseball. So if that's something for you, definitely give me a follow.
All right, Carlos Ramos saying, sub peeps, hit that like on the video for Ann and the Subway to Shea podcast. Make sure, yes, like this video, subscribe not only to Subway to Shea, but to Metsed Up, as well as Draft Neck Marc. And also, there's been a lot of content on today for the Mets. Everybody,
So much.
you guys did it. I'm doing it. Everybody's been doing it. After this show, Shea and Sons podcast has their Uncomfortable Conversations hosted by Keith and Key. AB from Till Mets to his part on there, Edge, Master Flip, Ruby, seen them all on X, as well as Chris Torres. So make sure you check them all out at 9 o'clock. And I'm pretty sure we're going to get a whole lot more stuff, especially if Pete Alonso comes on. But appreciate everyone for tuning in today. We'll be back Sunday at 10 a.m. Joe DeMayo is going to come on the show.
Nice.
We're going to talk about Ilion Pena and all the prospects that they signed, probably a little bit Roki Sasaki as well. And whatever happens with Pete. So we'll get into that. Follow me on X, Instagram, and TikTok at Subway to Shea. You can follow me at Ant Rivera 86. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, if you want to listen to it. And like I said earlier, on YouTube. Shout out to everyone in the chat. We had over 448 people on here. Make sure you like this video, like I said. And if I didn't get to your comment, I apologize. You know how it is, scrolling through tons and tons of comments, trying to get everyone in on there. Shout out to all of you. Come back again next time, and I'll do my best to get you on there. But for Anthony Rivera, for Draft Neck Marc Luino of Metsed Up podcast, this has been the Subway to Shea podcast. And always remember, let's go Mets.
Hell yeah.